The current phase of this crisis in Ukraine has been manufactured by Russian President Vladimir Putin. And I think for all of us, it's quite difficult to identify a specific trigger for the decision to build up forces to such an extent on the borders close to Ukraine, or to suddenly escalate events in December of last year. Moscow has actually successfully reasserted itself as the dominant political force and security provider in Eurasia. The other former Soviet states have now either been pressured into closer political and security relations with Moscow, or into a more neutral, marginal international status. Just as a couple of examples, Georgia's former president, Mikhail Saakashvili, who was a perennial thorn in Moscow's side, now sits in jail in Tbilisi. Russian officials and commentators frequently use Saakashvili and his fate as a cautionary tale for the rest of the region, including Ukraine. In summer 2020, in Armenia, President Nikol Pashinyan saw his domestic position and former foreign policy autonomy crushed by the war with Azerbaijan. Given the fact that Russia and Armenia have a long-standing defence pact, and Russian forces are permanently based in Armenia, Azerbaijan's military assault to retake territory occupied by Armenia for the last 3 decades was unlikely to have been feasible without a green light from Moscow. And Russia has now exploited the 2020 war to introduce its military forces into Nagorno-Karabakh, sidelining the OSCE Minsk group. Elsewhere, Belarusian strongman Alexander Lukashenko has been forced back into the fold after a disastrous presidential election on his part. And in January 2022, so just in the last month, Russia and its regional security alliance, the Collective Security Treaty Organization, or CSTO, were of course called in to quash protests and to quell a political power struggle in Kazakhstan. This was the first time that the CSTO was deployed on the territory of a member country. So Russia feels emboldened by all of these developments in Eurasia. From Russia's perspective, the United States played no significant role in addressing these upheavals, and the United States, again from Russia's perspective, seems grievously weakened at home and abroad. For Vladimir Putin, again this is his view, America's political disarray mirrors Russia's predicament immediately after the dissolution of the USSR and offers a rare opportunity. If the United States really is in a state of collapse at home and in retreat abroad, as Putin and the Kremlin assesses, then, in Putin's view again, perhaps Russia can overturn the last 30 years of American dominance in European security and also constrain Ukraine's independence. If we look at Europe, Moscow now sees ample opportunity to take advantage of developments there. The reverberations from Brexit, Poland and Hungary's disputes with the EU. Of course, we've just seen Viktor Orban in Moscow meeting with Vladimir Putin directly. The legacy of 4 years of rifts between the United States and its European allies, the departure of long-serving German Chancellor Angela Merkel from the political scene, preparations for presidential elections in France, and Washington's precipitous withdrawal from Afghanistan have exacerbated frictions and fractures in NATO and the EU that Russia thinks it can exploit. And again, from Russia's perspective, there's an opportunity because European military spending and operational readiness have declined over the last decades relative to the United States and Russia. And despite an uptick in spending and deployment since Russia annexed Crimea in 2014, 2 of our most significant European military partners, the UK and France, are increasingly at loggerheads, while our other major partner, Turkey, is preoccupied with Syria and the Middle East. Again, from Russia's perspective, Europe's punitive financial tools, along with the political will to deploy them, have been weakened. Moscow has effectively moved over the past decade, and especially since its annexation of Crimea in 2014, to shore up the Russian economy against Western sanctions, including through paying off state debts, making strategic direct investments in companies across Europe in critical infrastructure, energy and metallurgy, and also by deepening ties with the private sectors of key European countries, even at the height of this crisis, to try to offset any retaliatory economic actions that we might take. Putin and the Kremlin clearly believe that European and American investors will serve as Russian allies and advocates for limited sanctions, and that they will push for a speedy reconciliation with Russia, limiting our government's capacity for confrontation. Putin has also taken Russia's ambitions and positions during this crisis well beyond Eurasia and Europe. Russia is consolidating relationships with US adversaries with the blatantly signalled goal of challenging America's global posture. We've seen this with recent visits to Iran by Putin, and of course we're soon going to be seeing Vladimir Putin sitting alongside President Xi at the opening of the Beijing Olympics. And there have been many other instances where Putin has clearly moved out into other theatres to signal that Russia means business there as well. Putin's been quite explicit about these moves, as well as about the ideas of deploying new nuclear weapon systems to parts of territory closer to Europe, or perhaps even to the Caribbean, under some recent commentary out of Moscow. And this whole goal here seems to be to undermine the current international order, or at least to show an intent to do so, as a gambit to get the United States to the negotiating table. Russia has long sought a commitment from the United States, NATO and the European Union that it will have a clearly defined role in post-Cold War European security institutions, and also decision-making power whenever developments or events run counter to its interests. Putin's very mindful of 2024. not just when we have our presidential election, but also when he must theoretically, as well as in practice, submit himself for re-election at home. So in many respects, time is of the essence for Putin. He would like to achieve a resolution of these issues before 2024. And right now, his public opinion ratings are not what they used to be. The last time Putin's popular approval fell significantly was just before the annexation of Crimea back in 2014. At that juncture, annexation proved universally popular in Russia, and Putin may hope for a similar boost ahead of the Russian presidential elections by showing the Russian people that he can take decisive action against Ukraine, NATO and the United States. In the meantime, at home, Putin has done a very good job in Russia of making the United States and NATO look like the aggressors in the perpetration of this crisis. Abroad, he's also bent on convincing the rest of the world that Ukraine is either an internal matter for Russia to resolve or the object of a Cold War-style dust-up with the United States. It's Putin that's trying to depict this as a proxy war, like Korea and Vietnam were in the Cold War. The Russian president knows history inside out, Russian history that is, but he also has his very own version of it that isn't always shared, not only by us, but also by Ukrainians. The Kremlin and Putin have long deployed Russian values and Russian history as weapons in their conduct of information warfare, especially when it comes to Ukraine. And Putin has, of course, asserted that Russia and Ukraine are historically, culturally, linguistically and inextricably tied together. He posits that they have only been separated by an accident of history, the collapse of the Soviet Union. This is why we're in this crisis. The mere prospect of any kind of formal relationship between Ukraine and NATO, or between Ukraine and the EU, or Ukraine and the United States, is considered a direct threat to Russia. Every Russian official and commentator has stressed that the ultimate decision-making in Ukraine is up to Vladimir Putin. I think from Putin's perspective, he already has had something of a win, because he's got our undivided attention. And part of the exercise was clearly to get us to focus on him. Putin and others around him have been very frustrated that, from their perspective, they haven't been able to have a big sit-down with the United States in particular, to, in effect, go over and perhaps even have a redo of the European security arrangements since the end of the Cold War. If we look back to 2008, when Vladimir Putin was at that point sort of standing behind the shoulders of President Medvedev, Putin was, of course, the Prime Minister and had stepped aside for a period before coming back again. Dmitry Medvedev made a visit to Berlin in the early part of 2008 and made a pitch, an open request then for a rethinking and a revision and refurbishment of European security arrangements. We didn't pick this up because, in effect, what they were looking for was almost an overturning of the Helsinki Final Act and of the OSCE, and looking for something for more along the format that we'd seen in earlier centuries, more of a concert of Europe of the big powers, essentially the US and Russia sitting down and resolving the deposition of forces as well as the various institutional arrangements of Europe. So Putin's still looking for that. Putin will be able to say, look, I got everyone's attention. I've got everyone to resolve this question or address this question of security. I've got everyone to the negotiating table. Putin will want to be seen to be sitting down with President Biden in some fashion, just like he already did in Geneva. Putin is looking for something to show that his interests have been addressed in some fashion. If, however, he feels that they have not, he will continue to keep escalating, and that's where we might see some steps forward. It's all in the art of the diplomacy, and in a way that we can be able to show to Putin that the incredible costs that he's incurred, because it hasn't been cost-free in moving all these troops from the Russian Far East. I mean, this is logistically a major effort. These costs have paid off in some way.
You say that he may be losing some of his popularity in Russia. What difference does it make?
Putin cares very much because he is drawing all of his legitimacy from himself alone and the Constitution. He's got no political party. And as we've already, made very clear, that the Russian Duma, the parliament, doesn't, matter quite so much. What he's always had is his ratings, because it's also a signal to all the people around him who might actually be quite interested in his job over the longer term. Putin's been able to actually say to, a lot of younger guys who might say, well, hang on, are you really going to stay out till 2036 as president? By that time, you're going to be 84 years old. You'll have been in, power in Russia longer than any other contemporary modern leader, because Putin in 2020 basically pushed through this amendment to extend his presidential terms, and there were some questions about really the validity of that, even from the Russian constitutional perspective. And, all eyes are really on him and his inner circle as to whether they can carry off the smooth transition into the next phase of his presidency, or if he in fact has a successor that he wants to put in place. And if we've seen what happened in Kazakhstan, where President Nazarbayev handed off to President Tokayev, and we've just seen, what looks like some really nasty protests in response to, socioeconomic problems there, but also a power struggle behind the scenes, which often happens when you change over. And so, I think that Putin and the people around him are a little bit worried about their version of 2024 and what might happen. If we look back to what happened in 2014, certainly, the Russian intent was to push much further than the Donbass region. to push down to the areas around the Sea of Azov, port cities like Mariupol, to go to Kherson, which is further beyond the Crimean Peninsula, maybe as far as Odessa, to try to consolidate a hold over various proxy forces that would cut Ukraine off from the sea and also link up with Crimea. Very forceful action by the United States together with its allies, especially after the downing of the Malaysian airlines in 2014. I think we can make a very strong case that it helped to stop Russia and from the tracks, deter them somewhat and force them to pull back. Also because there was a strong response from the Ukrainian people in opposition to this. And I think what we've seen right now, and I think it's very important to listen to what General Hodges and Ambassador Taylor said about keeping up this pressure and this unity, and the unity that you've all displayed, honestly, here in Congress in a bipartisan fashion. That might also not have factored into Putin's calculations, to be frank. I think in showing that we are actually determined to counter this, it's given him some pause. The broader public is probably scratching their head and thinking, hang on, what's going on here? Why are we saying, the United States, that this is imminent, and the British are saying the same, and the guy who's sitting right there on the border is saying, no need to panic, nothing happening? In part, there's obviously is that real concern about panic and people actually already crossing Ukraine's borders into other countries in anticipation of a conflict, because we've already seen, of course, what happens when Russia invades in Donbass, and there have been many people displaced. Tens of thousands of people have left the Donbass region for Ukraine itself. Some have gone into Russia, so Ukraine already has a problem with internally displaced people and refugees. The other point is, of course, the economy. And in fact, when we think about what Putin might have already got out of this massive movement of troops, it might be exactly this, which is ruining Ukraine's current chances of turning around its economy. We have to be able to kind of allow him to have the space at home for declaring a win to give an off-ramp. Because he has to be able to spin it. I mean, he doesn't have the media breathing down his neck, but he does have the people around him that he has to demonstrate strength and infallibility to. I mean, he may not appear to be the genius to us that he wants to be, but he has to be at home. It has to look like a win for Putin. If he can say to the Russian people in this environment in which obviously there's a lot of slant in the media, and obviously the Kremlin can shape that in a major way, that they have used to good effect their military force, that they have, by threatening Europe, they've got our attention, they've got our full and undivided attention, that they've pushed us to the negotiating table. That in itself can certainly buy us some time for some more diplomacy to then craft something that might be a bit more meaningful as an off-ramp, which is going to be tricky, however, because we are not going to compromise on the sovereignty of Ukraine. That's not ours to compromise. And we're not going to compromise on NATO's open door policy, because for Finland, Sweden and other countries that are potentially aspirants for NATO candidacy, that's very important. If there is any change, that has to be Ukraine's to decide. Not just NATO trying to close that door. And that we might not actually want to give him. So part of that will be dependent on us as well. Of course, we do have a difference with some of our European allies and partners about, and I think actually some of our Western European partners, have been a bit of scepticism on the part of the French, for example, about whether this is an elaborate bluff. Well, if it is an elaborate bluff, it's also a very expensive bluff on the part of Putin. This is the first time that we've seen forces being moved from the Russian Far East, certainly since the end of the Cold War, for example, to the borders with Ukraine. And my experience also of Putin is that he usually, if he threatens, he usually intends to act in some fashion. And the Russians themselves have threatened this military technical action. Each time, people have thought that Putin was bluffing. Georgia, for example, in 2008, he moved in. In Syria, we weren't sure that they were going to intervene on behalf of Assad, and they did. We've had a firefight between paramilitary forces, again, so they can also use subversion. In Syria in 2018, when members of the Wagner paramilitary group of Russian contract forces fired on our special forces, and we had a whole firefight with the Russians behind the scenes. So we should be very careful about the idea of this being a bluff, but I know that many of our allies are a bit sceptical about what they see is happening. Time is on Russia's side right now for energy, because Russia has, very effectively continued to dominate the gas sector in a number of critical European countries, including Germany and most notably Hungary. Viktor Orban being in Moscow to essentially sign a massive gas deal for cheaper gas, which Russia also hopes will give political influence. And of course, that's why we've all been concerned about Nord Stream 2. But over time, Russia knows that its dominance in the European energy sector will change. The Europeans haven't done a great job of gas storage because of the COVID pandemic, not really sure how the economy would bounce back. It's a cold winter. They're worried about gas shortages and other energy shortages, and Russia hopes that, of course, that will mean that there will be much reluctance to put sanctions on the energy sector, and there'll be a lot of pressure from the European energy companies and consumers and governments against sanctions.